Hello, I am Erin York, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of South Carolina, and I'm joined with my colleagues here.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I am a PhD student in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policies at the University of South Carolina.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Hobson. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Louisiana State University.
And so we're here with Jeff today because he contributed Chapter 3 to our Perspectives on the History of Higher Education volume, which just came out, which is titled The History of American College Football, Institutional Policy, Culture, and Reform. And so we're just going to have a bit of a conversation today with Jeff here about his chapter. And we can't wait to just see what you have to say. We both enjoyed your chapter so much, and so we can just get into it here. So Jeff, if you can tell us a little bit about your research background, what drew you to this chapter, and then for those of our readers who haven't gotten a chance to dig into your chapter yet, can you give us just a brief summary of the chapter?
Sure. This chapter is an outgrowth of my master's thesis, which I wrote at James Madison University, and I looked specifically at lost cause culture on New South College University campuses. New South ranging essentially from the end of Reconstruction up to, it's debatable on where it ends, but usually the interwar period or up to World War II. And I had a chapter in that specifically looked at college football culture and its relationship to the lost cause. And once I started working specifically on this subject, really narrowing in on these three universities, I started to look at how these cultures developed and changed over time, specifically how they really tracked along with the lost cause movement. It's really remarkable how the trajectory of these cultures really followed the trajectory of the lost cause, going from Confederate celebration to commercialization. And so that's really what the focus of the chapter is about. It's about not just the lost cause. I touch on issues of masculinity, which of course is part of the lost cause movement. These men had fought a war and they lost it, and it's understandable that caused a crisis in Southern masculinity, and part of a larger crisis in American masculinity at the same time as we transition from an agricultural society where men have much more independence to an industrial society where they've really lost a lot of that independence. And so football itself is an outgrowth of that. And then college football in the South specifically ties on its kind of special, Southern cultural aspects onto the game of football.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff, I was really interested in this chapter. I'm from Mississippi, so when I saw Ross Barnett in the first sentence, I was like, okay, you've got me. So reading about the University of Mississippi, Louisiana State University, and UVA, I was wondering what unique characteristics these institutions had that made you decide to focus specifically.
Good question. I focused on these primarily because they all three were institutions that existed in the antebellum period. So they predate the Civil War. And they all had students that fought in the Civil War. And so there are other schools that fit that criteria. Being just perfectly frank, part of it is access to resources. As a graduate student, I have limited resources, so I've visited campuses that are close to where I go to school. And so it's a combination of, it was purposeful to choose three antebellum colleges that sent students off to war. And then part of it is just practicality. Those are the archives that I had the best access to.
So do you plan to continue this research with other institutions in the future?
If I'm lucky enough to get a tenure track job, then yes, I would like to. I've kind of diverted from that research. My dissertation is completely different. I look at a group of Union and Confederate veterans that were hired by the Egyptian army to modernize its military and create a new Egyptian empire. But I would like to return to this because I know there's a book in it. I know there's a book because I want to look at the lost cause on student camp or and student cultures on these college campuses entirely. Newspapers, yearbooks, I mean, those things are chock full of lost cause culture. And but also I'm interested in how these campuses propagate white supremacy. So I look at what's taught in the classroom policies, what the professors create, you know, what their output looks like, to see how these institutions kind of, as I argue, give an academic bona fides to otherwise kind of just everyday, as I call it, folk racism, just kind of like a folk tale, folk story. You know, it gives kind of an academic bearing or a veneer to these otherwise kind of everyday folk racist ideals. So yeah, I would like to push that farther. It just, you know, is a matter of, you know, the hiring process.
That's completely understandable and also very relatable. So I have a question for those of our readers and those coming to our museum exhibit who may not be familiar with terminology like the Lost Cause and its relation to the Reconstruction era, Civil War, and wrapped in then with these ideas of masculinity. Can you go through that a little bit for us?
Sure. The Lost Cause is a term that thankfully has taken on a much more broader understanding lately. It's shown up in newspaper accounts, magazine articles. I've read, you know, stories on the Lost Cause by historians and amateur historians and journalists alike. And I'm very thankful that more people know what it is and more people understand how important it was to shaping you know, Southern culture, but then our understanding of the past for decades. So essentially the Lost Cause was the memorialization or the commemoration of the men who fought for the Confederacy to preserve slave society in the Civil War. And it began immediately, really kind of during the Civil War, but sprung up afterward in this idea of just commemorating the dead. So it started with memorial organizations placing wreaths on cemeteries, making sure that Confederate remains are were put in a what people wanted to be a respectful situation. So you to have the development of Confederate cemeteries and so forth. And so women are always at the forefront of this, although the Confederate veterans themselves are active, especially in the 1880s. But by the 1890s, the sons of Confederate veterans, and especially the United Daughters of the Confederacy, are the main proponents of the Lost Cause. And so the 1890s into the early 1900s is when it really hits its stride. And that's when we start to see the construction of all of the monuments that are being taken down now. And that's also when we see the development of Lost Cause culture on these student campuses. Now, part of that is that those Confederate veterans are dying off in increasing numbers. And so white Southerners really want to venerate them while they're still alive. They also want to hear their story. So I have a line in there, this is a paraphrase, but you know, someone from the member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, or maybe is at the knee of a Confederate veteran. There's this idea that the best way to be educated about, you know, the real past, about what really happened, was from those Confederate veterans. But it was more than just erecting monuments. It was this kind of wholesale attempt to create a fabricated history of the Civil War, especially its causes, and then what caused the ultimate defeat of the Confederacy. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy were really the paramount organization in that. As I point out in my chapter, they actually created, you know, these different children's affiliated chapters. And they actually recited what was called the Confederate Catechism, which is a call and response. You know, what caused the Civil War? You know, oh, it's about state rights. Why did the South lose? They were just outmanned. They weren't outfought, right? These falsehoods about the cause of the war and the Confederates' ultimate defeat. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy called Southern children living monuments to the Confederacy. They believed that if they could inculcate their beliefs in the upcoming generation, that they could help maintain, you know, Southern culture and Southern society in the face of tremendous change. So I mentioned, you know, a movement from an agricultural to an industrial economy that was happening in the South, but not nearly as robustly as it happened in the North, but we do see a transition from a more rural focused power structure to a more town and city focused power structure. And then of course, the biggie in the room is that you have millions of free Black people in a way that you simply didn't during the Civil War. And so how do you maintain this society that they believed was the pinnacle? They really did believe that Southern society represented the pinnacle of civilization. And so for them to maintain that, they had to have a rigid racial hierarchy, as well as a patriarchy that, venerated men, especially, really masculine men like the Confederate veteran at the top. And so in all of this change, the Lost Cause helped both to commemorate the men who fought for the Civil War, their sacrifice, but also to kind of ameliorate the anxiety that these changes created in Southern society.
Thank you. That is an amazing explanation. And one of my questions was going to be, how do you see your chapter tying into culture today in the South and what's happening in our country? And I think you hit the nail on the head in so many different ways with talking about monuments coming down and talking about how do we approach these topics in the classroom currently. And I think especially when we think about, we do units on the Civil War and we do units on desegregation, and then there's this long time period that kind of can get overlooked, and the Reconstruction era can really just be one day or perhaps a week out of our curriculum, and that's about it. So I think that was an amazing explanation, and I think that it really provides some great scaffolding for our readers who may not be historians.
Well, and also too, you brought up Caitlin Ross Barnett earlier, and I purposefully opened and closed with a very political scene, because I wrote this in the midst of the Colin Kaepernick kerfuffle, right? Everyone saying, keep politics out of sports. Well, they're saying that to a Black man, right? Here's a white man that is very overtly politicizing sports, right? He is using college football as a place for him to, to try and drum up more support to keep Ole Miss a segregated institution. And so hopefully readers will see that politics and sports have always been interlinked. And so this idea that we can somehow separate them today is just simply ahistorical. We say the Pledge of Allegiance at that is a political act. And so this idea that politics and sports are somehow, not linked is something that I would like to just, hopefully people read that and see that, oh, well, they've always been, one and the same, or at least related. And then as far as other stuff today, you're exactly right. I mentioned in my article that these monuments, as well as, these college football cultures, they're placemaking, right? They're stamping these stadiums and these college campuses as white places, right? A Black person's not going to feel very welcome at a place that explicitly venerates Confederate veterans who fought to keep Black people enslaved, right? And so by tearing down those monuments, by taking down those vestiges of the past that were purposefully meant to mark these places as white dominated places, we're making these places more welcome to non-white people.
Well, thank you for joining us. This has been a wonderful interview. I think it's been incredibly informative, and it's a great companion to the chapter and this book as a whole. So just thank you again, Jeff, for your time.
Thank you both. It's been a great pleasure.